Forensic psychology is the intersection between the study of psychology and the justice system. It involves understanding fundamental legal principles, particularly with regard to expert witness testimony and the specific content area of concern, e.g., competence to stand trial, child custody and visitation, or workplace discrimination, as well as relevant jurisdictional considerations, e.g., in the United States, the definition of insanity in criminal trials differs from state to state in order to be able to interact appropriately with judges, attorneys, and other legal professionals. An important aspect of forensic psychology is the ability to testify in court as an expert witness, reformulating psychological findings into the legal language of the courtroom, providing information to legal personnel in a way that can be understood. Further, in order to be a credible witness, the forensic psychologist must understand the philosophy, rules, and standards of the judicial system. Primarily, they must understand the adversarial system. There are also rules about hearsay evidence and most importantly, the exclusionary rule. Lack of a firm grasp of these procedures will result in the forensic psychologist losing credibility in the courtroom. A forensic psychologist can be trained in clinical, social, organizational, or any other branch of psychology. Generally, a forensic psychologist is designated as an expert in a specific field of study. The number of areas of expertise in which a forensic psychologist qualifies as an expert increases with experience and reputation. Forensic neuropsychologists are generally asked to appear as expert witnesses in court to discuss cases that involve issues with the brain or brain damage. They may also deal with issues of whether a person is legally competent to stand trial. Questions asked by the court of a forensic psychologist are generally not questions regarding psychology but are legal questions, and the response must be in language the court understands. For example, a forensic psychologist is frequently appointed by the court to assess a defendant's competence to stand trial. The court also frequently appoints a forensic psychologist to assess the state of mind of the defendant at the time of the offense. This is referred to as an evaluation of the defendant's sanity or insanity, which relates to criminal responsibility at the time of the offense. These are not primarily psychological questions but rather legal ones. Thus, a forensic psychologist must be able to translate psychological information into a legal framework. Forensic psychologists may be called on to provide sentencing recommendations, treatment recommendations, or any other information the judge requests, such as information regarding mitigating factors, assessment of future risk, and evaluation of witness credibility. Forensic psychology also involves training and evaluating police or other law enforcement personnel, providing law enforcement with criminal profiles, and in other ways working with police departments. Forensic psychologists may work with any party and in criminal or family law. In the United States, they may also help with jury selection. Training and education. Forensic psychologists may hold a PhD or Psy.D. in clinical psychology, counseling psychology, social psychology, organizational psychology, school psychology, or experimental psychology. In order for a psychologist to practice as a forensic psychologist in the United States, it is preferred, but not necessarily required, that the individual be a state-licensed psychologist and receive certification as a diplomate in forensic psychology by the American Board of Forensic Psychology, although the latter is less important to judges. Ideally, the psychologist would have some years of postdoctoral experience in forensic psychology and have training and supervision in forensic psychology. However, practices vary from state to state and from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. In the United States legal system, the ultimate authority is the judge, and the judge may select whomever he or she sees fit to qualify as an expert. In other countries, training and practitioner requirements may vary. In the United Kingdom, for example, a person must obtain the graduate basis for registration with the British Psychological Society—normally through an undergraduate degree. This would be followed by stages 1 academic and 2 supervised practice of the diploma in forensic psychology, which would normally take 3 years full-time and 4 years part-time. Assessment occurs via examination, research, supervised practice, and the submission of a portfolio showing expertise across a range of criminological and legal applications of psychology. Once qualified as a chartered psychologist with a specialism in forensic psychology, a practitioner must engage in continued professional development and demonstrate how much, of what kind, each year, in order to renew his/her practicing certificate. Academic researcher. Academic forensic psychologists engage in teaching, researching, training, and supervision of students, and other education-related activities. These professionals usually have an advanced degree in psychology, most likely a PhD. While their main focus is research, it is not unusual for them to take on any of the other positions of forensic psychologists. These professionals may be employed at various settings, which include colleges and universities, research institutes, government or private agencies, and mental health agencies. Forensic psychology research pertains to psychology and the law, whether it be criminal or civil. Researchers test hypotheses empirically and apply the research on issues related to psychology and the law. They may also conduct research on mental health law and policy evaluation. Some famous psychologists in the field include Saul Kassin, very widely known for studying false confessions, and Elizabeth Loftus, known for her research on eyewitness memory. She has provided expert witness testimony for many cases. Consultant to law enforcement. Forensic psychologists also assist with law enforcement. They work in collaboration with the police force or other law enforcement agencies. Law enforcement psychologists are responsible for assisting law enforcement personnel. They are frequently trained to help with crisis intervention, including post-trauma and suicide. Other duties of law enforcement psychologists include development of police training programs, stress management, personnel management, and referral of departmental personnel as well as their families for specialized treatment and counseling. Of course, ethical issues may arise, such as the question of who the client is, the police officer referred or the department, in regards to confidentiality. Correctional psychologist. Correctional psychologists work with inmates and offenders in correctional settings. They serve both the role of an evaluator and a treatment provider to those who have been imprisoned or on parole or probation. Correctional psychologists may also take on the role of researcher or expert witness and frequently perform a wide range of psychological testing. Evaluator. These forensic psychologists take on the role of evaluating parties in criminal or civil cases on mental health issues related to their case. For criminal cases, they may be called on to evaluate issues including, but not limited to, defendant's competence to stand trial, their mental state at the time of the offense, insanity, and their risk for future violent acts. For civil cases, they may be called on to evaluate issues including, but not limited to, an individual's psychological state after an accident or the families of custody cases. Any assessment made by an evaluator is not considered a counseling session, and therefore whatever is said or done is not confidential. It is the obligation of the evaluator to inform the parties that everything in the session will be open to scrutiny in a forensic report or expert testimony. Evaluators work closely with expert witnesses, discussed below, as many are called into court to testify with what they have come to conclude from their evaluations. They have a variety of employment settings, such as forensic and state psychiatric hospitals, mental health centers, and private practice. Evaluators usually have had training as clinical psychologists. Expert witness. Unlike fact witnesses, who are limited to testifying about what they know or have observed, expert witnesses have the ability to express opinion because, as their name suggests, they are presumed to be experts in a certain topic. They possess specialized knowledge about the topic. Expert witnesses are called upon to testify on matters of mental health, clinical expertise, or other areas of expertise such as social, experimental, cognitive, or developmental. The role of being an expert witness is not primary, and it is usually performed in conjunction with another role such as that of researcher, academic, evaluator, or clinical psychologist. Clinical forensic psychologists evaluate a defendant and are then called upon as expert witnesses to testify on the mental state of the defendant. In the past, expert witnesses primarily served the court rather than the litigants. However, nowadays that very rarely happens, and most of the recruitment for expert witness is completed by trial attorneys. But regardless of who calls in the expert, it is the judge who determines whether or not the expert witness will be accepted. All ethical expert witnesses must be able to resolve the issue of relating to the case and being an advocate. They must decide between loyalty to their field of expertise or to the outcome of the case. Treatment provider. Treatment providers are forensic psychologists who administer psychological intervention or treatment to individuals who require or request services in both criminal and civil cases. In criminal proceedings, treatment providers may be asked to provide psychological interventions to individuals who require treatment for the restoration of competency, after having been determined by the courts as incompetent to stand trial. They may be asked to provide treatment for the mental illness of those deemed insane at the crime. They may also be called to administer treatment to minimize the likelihood of future acts of violence for individuals who may be at a high risk of committing a violent offense. As for civil proceedings, treatment providers may have to treat families going through divorce and/or custody cases. They may also provide treatment to individuals who have suffered psychological injuries as a result of some kind of trauma. Treatment providers and evaluators work in the same types of settings: forensic and state psychiatric hospitals, mental health centers, and private practices. Not surprisingly, their work may greatly overlap. And although not ethically encouraged, the same forensic psychologist may take on both the role of treatment provider and evaluator for the same client. Trial consultant. Forensic psychologists are often involved in trial consulting and are part of legal psychology. A trial consultant, a jury consultant, or a litigation consultant, are social scientists who work with legal professionals such as a trial attorney to aid in case preparation, which includes selection of, jury, development of case strategy, and witness preparation. Trial consultants rely heavily on research. Trial consultants may also attend seminars directed at the improvement of jury selection and trial presentation skills. Becoming a trial consultant does not necessarily require a doctoral degree or even a bachelor's degree. To become a trial consultant, all that may be necessary is some level of training. Trial consultants are faced with many ethical issues. Not only are they social scientists, they may be entrepreneurs as well, marketing their business and keeping fixed costs. This is a challenge to their ethical responsibilities as applied researchers who need to be following guidelines of ethical research. Trial consultants are hired by attorneys, and conflicts may arise when each party has a different viewpoint on a certain issue, such as which prospective jurors should be excused, whether the jurors' preferences are appropriate for the case or not, etc. They must always keep in mind that they are employees of the attorneys and are not able to make the ultimate decisions regarding the case. Distinction between forensic and therapeutic evaluation. A forensic psychologist's interactions with and ethical responsibilities to the client differ widely from those of a psychologist dealing with a client in a clinical setting. Scope. Rather than the broad set of issues a psychologist addresses in a clinical setting, a forensic psychologist addresses a narrowly defined set of events or interactions of a non-clinical nature. Importance of client's perspective. A clinician places primary importance on understanding the client's unique point of view, while the forensic psychologist is interested in accuracy, and the client's viewpoint is secondary. Voluntariness. Usually in a clinical setting a psychologist is dealing with a voluntary client. A forensic psychologist evaluates clients by order of a judge or at the behest of an attorney. Autonomy. Voluntary clients have more latitude and autonomy regarding the assessment's objectives. Any assessment usually takes their concerns into account. The objectives of a forensic examination are confined by the applicable statutes or common law elements that pertain to the legal issue in question. Threats to validity. While the client and therapist are working toward a common goal, although unconscious distortion may occur, in the forensic context there is a substantially greater likelihood of intentional and conscious distortion. Relationship and dynamics. Therapeutic interactions work toward developing a trusting, empathic therapeutic alliance. A forensic psychologist may not ethically nurture the client or act in a helping role, as the forensic evaluator has divided loyalties and there are substantial limits on confidentiality he can guarantee the client. A forensic evaluator must always be aware of manipulation in the adversary context of a legal setting. These concerns mandate an emotional distance that is unlike a therapeutic interaction. Pace and setting. Unlike therapeutic interactions which may be guided by many factors, the forensic setting with its court schedules, limited resources, and other external factors, place great time constraints on the evaluation without opportunities for re-evaluation. The forensic examiner focuses on the importance of accuracy and the finality of legal dispositions. Practice. The forensic psychologist views the client or defendant from a different point of view than a traditional clinical psychologist does. Seeing the situation from the client's point of view or empathizing is not the forensic psychologist's task. Traditional psychological tests and interview procedure are not sufficient when applied to the forensic situation. In forensic evaluations, it is important to assess the consistency of factual information across multiple sources. Forensic evaluators must be able to provide the source on which any information is based. Forensic psychologists routinely assess response bias or performance validity, whereas treating psychologists do not. Forensic media psychology is a subspecialty in forensic psychology that analyzes behavior related to social media, intellectual property, entertainment, including film, television, etc., medical education and other areas where media is used in behavioral psychology. Forensic psychologists perform a wide range of tasks within the criminal justice system. Malingering. An important and pressing question in any type of forensic assessment is the issue of malingering and deception. In some criminal cases, the court views malingering or feigning illness as obstruction of justice and sentences the defendant accordingly. Competency evaluations. If there is a question of the accused's competency to stand trial, a forensic psychologist is appointed by the court to examine and assess the individual. The individual may be in custody or may have been released on bail. Based on the forensic assessment, a recommendation is made to the court whether or not the defendant is competent to proceed to trial. If the defendant is considered incompetent to proceed, the report or testimony will include recommendations for the interim period during which an attempt at restoring the individual's competency to understand the court and legal proceedings, as well as participate appropriately in their defense, will be made. Often, this is an issue of committed, on the advice of a forensic psychologist, to a psychiatric treatment facility until such time as the individual is deemed competent. As a result of Ford v. Wainwright, a case by a Florida inmate on death row that was brought before the Supreme Court of the United States, forensic psychologists are appointed to assess the competency of an inmate to be executed in death penalty cases. Sanity evaluations. The forensic psychologist may also be appointed by the court to evaluate the defendant's state of mind at the time of the offense. These are defendants who the judge, prosecutor, or public defender believe, through personal interaction with the defendant or through reading the police report, may have been significantly impaired at the time of the offense. Other evaluations. Forensic psychologists are frequently asked to make an assessment of how dangerous an individual is or their risk of re-offending. They may provide information and recommendations necessary for sentencing purposes, grants of probation, and the formulation of conditions of parole, which often involves an assessment of the offender's ability to be rehabilitated. They are also asked questions of witness credibility and malingering. Occasionally, they may also provide criminal profiles to law enforcement. Due to the Supreme Court decision upholding involuntary commitment laws for predatory sex offenders in Kansas v. Hendricks, it is likely that forensic psychologists will become involved in making recommendations in individual cases of end-of-sentence civil commitment decisions. A forensic psychologist can also practice some level of applied psychology in conducting some investigations, and also make use of the scientific methods. Ethical implications. A forensic psychologist generally practices within the confines of the courtroom, incarceration facilities, and other legal setting. It is important to remember that the forensic psychologist is equally likely to be testifying for the prosecution as for the defense attorney. A forensic psychologist does not take a side, as do the psychologists described below. The ethical standards for a forensic psychologist differ from those of a clinical psychologist or other practicing psychologist because the forensic psychologist is not an advocate for the client and nothing the client says is guaranteed to be kept confidential. This makes evaluation of the client difficult, as the forensic psychologist needs and wants to obtain all information while it is often not in the client's best interest to provide it. The client has no control over how that information is used. Despite the signing of a waiver of confidentiality, most clients do not realize the nature of the evaluative situation. Furthermore, the interview techniques differ from those typical of a clinical psychologist and require an understanding of the criminal mind and criminal and violent behavior. For example, even indicating to a defendant being interviewed that an effort will be made to get the defendant professional help may be grounds for excluding the expert's testimony. In addition, the forensic psychologist deals with a range of clients unlike those of the average practicing psychologist. Because the client base is by and large criminal, the forensic psychologist is immersed in an abnormal world. As such, the population evaluated by the forensic psychologist is heavily weighted with specific personality disorders. The typical grounds for malpractice suits also apply to the forensic psychologist, such as wrongful commitment, inadequate informed consent, duty and breach of duty, and standards of care issues. Some situations are more clear-cut for the forensic psychologist. The duty to warn, which is mandated by many states, is generally not a problem because the client or defendant has already signed a release of information, unless the victim is not clearly identified and the issue of the identifiability of the victim arises. However, in general the forensic psychologist is less likely to encounter malpractice suits than a clinical psychologist. The forensic psychologist does have some additional professional liability issues. As mentioned above, confidentiality in a forensic setting is more complicated than in a clinical setting, as the client or defendant is apt to misinterpret the limits of confidentiality despite being warned and signing a release. See also: Applied psychology, forensic psychiatry, settled insanity, competency evaluation law, list of United States Supreme Court cases involving mental health, media psychology. Footnotes. Further reading: Adler, J.R. ed. 2004. Forensic Psychology, Concepts, Debates and Practice. Cullumpton, Willan. Bartle, C.R., and Bartle, A.M. 1999. History of Forensic Psychology. In A. K. Hess and Irving B. Wiener, eds. Handbook of Forensic Psychology, 2nd ed. London, John Wiley & Sons. Blackburn, R. 1996. What is Forensic Psychology? Legal and Criminological Psychology. 1996 February, Volume 1, Part 1 3–16. Dolby, J.T. 1997. Applications of Psychology in the Law Practice, A Guide to Relevant Issues, Practices and Theories. Chicago, American Bar Association. ISBN 0-8493-0811-9. Davis, J. A. 2001. Stalking Crimes and Victim Protection. CRC Press. 538 pages. ISBN 0-8493-0811-9. HBK, Duntley, J.D., and Shackelford, T.K. 2006. Toward an Evolutionary Forensic Psychology. Social Biology, 51, 161–165. Full text. Gudjonsson, G. 1991. Forensic Psychology, The First Century. Journal of Forensic Psychiatry, 2 129. G. H. Gudjonsson and Lionel Horwood, Forensic Psychology. A Guide to Practice. 1998. ISBN 0-415-13291-6. PBK, ISBN 0-415-13290-8. HBK, Melton, G. B., Petrila, J., Poythress, N. G., Otto, R. K., Mossman, D., and Condi, L. O. 2017. Psychological Evaluations for the Courts, A Handbook for Mental Health Professionals and Lawyers, 4th ed. New York, Guilford. ISBN 9781462532667. Ogloff, J.R.P., and Finkelman, D. 1999. Psychology and Law, An Overview. In R. Roche, S. D. Hart, and J. R. P. Ogloff, eds. Psychology and Law, The State of the Discipline. New York, Springer. ISBN 0-306-45950-7. O'Mahony, B. 2013. So, You Want to Be a Forensic Psychologist? Create Space. ISBN 9781482011814. Ribner, N. G. 2002. California School of Professional Psychology Handbook of Juvenile Forensic Psychology. Jossi Base. ISBN 0787959480. Roche, R., and Zapf, P. A. eds. 2012. Forensic Assessments in Criminal and Civil Law, A Handbook for Lawyers. NY, Oxford University Press. ISBN 9780199766857. Rogers, R. ed. 2008. Clinical Assessment of Malingering and Deception, 3rd ed. New York, Guilford. ISBN 9781462507351. External links. American Academy of Forensic Psychology Board Certified Forensic Experts, Continuing Education. American Board of Forensic Psychology Board Certification and other information. All About Forensic Psychology Comprehensive Guide to Forensic Psychology. American Psychology, Law Society. European Association of Psychology and Law. European Association of Psychology and Law Student Society. Resources and fact sheets on forensic psychology. UK Forensic Psychology. Advice about forensic psychology from the British Psychological Society. Landmark cases in forensic law. List of forensic landmark cases chronologically. Open Access Journal of Forensic Psychology. Quality of Practice in Forensic Psychology. Clinical Forensic Psychology Career Information, by Dr. Patricia Zapf. Forensic Psychology Salary, Jobs, Degree and Career Information. ForensicPsychologyOnline.com. Forensic Psychology Online has many resources, including steps to becoming a forensic psychologist and lists of top forensic psychology schools. Introducing Forensic Psychology, free course on the basics of forensic psychology from the Open University.